Hello everyone and welcome to part 4 of the Blender Unity Flappy Bird tutorial. So in part 4 we're going to be adding movement to the bird and its animations. Okay, so where did we leave off? So actually before I get into where we left off, let's just show what we're going for. So what we'd like to see by the end of the tutorial is some movement where the bird flaps its wings, goes up and down the screen and tilts its head when it's flapping. That's what we're going for. Where we're at, so from the last tutorial, part 3, I think we were at this point here where we had a really basic Animator controller set up just so that we could see the flapping animation. So when I played that, it looked something like this. Yeah, that's right. And we're going to be changing that. So let's have a quick look at where we begin. Right. So the first thing to note is from the last tutorial, I made a rename of one of the variables in Blender, and I have now closed Blender, so I'll have to open Blender. But while Blender's opening, I'll talk about what I did. So I basically renamed one of the armatures, or the armature in our bird that you can see here in Unity, called wings. It used to be called armature, and the reason I did that is so that when we look at the animations in Unity here, they have a name which kind of makes sense. So they're called wings, this bar thing / flapping, and wings bar flying, whereas before they used to be called armature flapping, armature flying, which is not that great. So yeah, just to recap, so in Blender all I did to achieve that was over here in the outliner panel, I renamed this thing here by double clicking on it, wings. And then of course I had to export the model and animations as FBX. You can see the last video on how to do that. So I'll close Blender now and let's get into it. So we're set up now, and like I said, we have the animations named correctly coming in from our FBX file into the Unity project. And the first thing we want to do is to make the bird kind of fall. We want the bird to have some gravity basically. So in order to achieve that, we're just going to skip straight to VS Code. Oh, we'll get to the code in a second, but we're going to add a script and then add some code to the script. So the first thing I'll do is click on my bird game object in Unity, add a new script. So new script, I'm going to call it bird, and then I'm going to go to VS Code where I already have the project open the bird script, and here we go. So I'm going to start with a little bit of pseudocode, and to do that I'm going to need to put some of my notes back on screen so I can know what the heck is going on. Okay, give me just a second. Right, so this one. So yeah, so I'm gonna be adding some code to that script now. And the first thing I'll do is to add pseudocode. I always like to start with pseudocode because it allows me to feel like I've written something useful without actually knowing how I'm going to do it. So yeah, I need to, inside my update function is where I'm going to do most of my logic. I need to make the bird fall. And I'll put in the other steps I'm going to do later on. So I'd like to, when the spacebar is pressed, make bird fly, make bird move up, and then also I'd like to flap the bird wings when the spacebar is pressed. And finally, as we saw in the little demo I gave at the beginning, I'd like to make the tilt bird upwards when flapping. Okay, so that's what I'd like to achieve, and let's get started with making the bird fall. So I would like to have, I'm going to need a couple of things here. I'm going to use a character controller on the bird to make the movement happen, and then I'm going to add some sort of simulated gravity. So let's just check. Do I have a character? So I have an animator and character controller already added. Yeah. So what I did to add the character controller here is I right-clicked or went to add component, and I added a character controller like that. And that's all I've got here. That's the default settings for that. So I can access this now. like by adding a new variable, and I'll make it a private variable. So this is character controller. Yeah, I'll name it character controller. And when the game starts, I need to assign this character controller. So character controller equals get component character controller. Great. Actually, I'm going to rename this. These private variables, I'm going to give this underscore naming convention just so we know that they're private. And yes, I need to use this now to make the bird fall with some gravity. So I'll introduce another variable, constant this time, and I'll call it the gravity. And since I've already played with this, I'm going to set it to 15. The F part tells it it's a float, which is a number with lots of decimal places. And I'll also need to introduce another variable for the speed. So when the bird is either flying upwards or downwards, it needs a speed that can change over time. So I'm going to add that, and I'm going to call it the physics term, which is called velocity. So vector 3, velocity, and this is going to be a vector because it is an empty vector. Well, not an empty vector. It's a vector with 0, 0, 0 for the x, y, and z components of its velocity, and we're going to be changing that as the bird flies. Okay, so the first thing I need to do then, when the bird falls, I need to set that and I'm going to rename that velocity as well. To make that bird fall, every time the update loop is called, we're going to go velocity.y, because it's the up and down direction, minus equals, so equals velocity.y minus, that's what that shortcut means, gravity times time dot delta time. So every little slice of time that passes between update loop calls, we need to change the velocity by an amount specified by gravity. Okay, and then of course the last thing I need to do here is make sure the bird actually moves after the velocity has changed. So this is where I do the character controller dot move, and I'm going to say, in here I'm going to say use the velocity we've calculated above, multiply it by time to calculate a slice or a slice of movement that the bird is going to move each frame, each call of the update loop. So delta time, and that's that. So what I hope now is when I run this script, run the game with that script, that the bird falls off the screen. That's all that should happen for now. So waiting for the assemblies to reload. Perhaps I should close the other window I had open. That might make this a bit faster. All right, let's see. Okie dokie. So let's see what happens when I press play. Does the bird fall off the screen? Yes, it did. And it's also flapping its wings from the last tutorial. Okay, great. So yeah, and in case you're wondering about that update function, that is just being run in what's called an update loop by the game engine. And so basically as fast as it can, every frame that will be rendered or shown on the screen, this update function is called, and that's where we're making our changes to physics. Okay, next thing then. So I would now like to make the bird fly with its wings outstretched. So what I mean by that is I would like to be able to press space and see the bird go up and down, and that when it's not flapping its wings are out straight. So to start doing that, I need to go into Unity and access the Animator controller that we created previously. We did, yeah. So in the previous session, we just added this kind of placeholder animation here. I'm going to delete that for now, and I'm going to add in to this Animator controller now the flying, which is the bird's wings outstretched animation first, and that will make the bird's wings outstretched. But then I need to start adding in some more states, that's what each of these rectangles are called, to make the bird's wings flap. So let's add that now. So this is the bird flapping or wings flapping animation. And we need to make some transitions between these states to make that happen. So the first one I'll add is to go from flying to flapping. We need a transition like this, and then I am going to introduce a trigger in order to trigger that transition from the code in our bird script. So under parameters here in the Animator controller, I need to add a new parameter, and I'm going to make it a trigger that we can call from the code, and I'm just going to call it flap. Flat as in flap your wings, bird. Okay, and then I will so now I'll use that trigger that will be called from the code to actually trigger this transition from flying to flapping. So I need to add a condition here, and it just by default it selects the flap condition, and then I've got some transition configuration to make here as well. So I'm just going to move these. I'm going to change some settings here, so I don't need an exit time because I have a condition that's just triggering this. I'm going to move this scrubber. Oh, that's the play scrubber. I need to move it over at least. I need to move this scrubber to the end, and I want to make a little bit of transition time. And then I'm going to move the flapping animation to the start of that transition. And that one should be right at the end. So I'll put that to 100%. I'm not going to let me do that. But 102% is just fine. Yep, so go drag that over. Okay, cool. So yeah, to go from flying to flapping, we're just going to wait for this flap condition to come from the code, and that should trigger that. And I can preview that what that looks like down here. So a little bit janky at the moment if I slow it down by doing it myself. So it's flapping, sorry, it's flying, and then it's flapping, and then it kind of finishes and starts again. That's where it looks a bit janky, so I'm happy with that. All right, next piece. So, oh, by the way, like just a heads up. So I'm using all this state machine control of the animations. You could equally do a lot of this control in code, but I'm just trying to keep this tutorial as kind of simple as possible. And I figure that by using a visual representation of the flow of the animation states, that is a relatively simple way to do it. Okay, so we've got the flapping happening from flying. Now we need another transition. So what happens when the bird finishes flapping? Then it needs to go back to the flying with its wings outstretched animation. So I'm going to click on this transition this time. This one has an exit time because this just happens whenever the flapping animation completes. So we don't need to use the trigger in this case. And I'm going to, again, this is really the one actually where I need to make sure that it transitions right off the end. So you'll see why later. So if I move these scrubbers all the way, so I move that to 100%, and then the flying animation comes after that point, and okay, and I could add a little bit more transition here as well. Why not? There we go. That was middle mouse scroll. Yep. So I've added quite a lot of transition there. All right. Yeah, that looks mildly right. So okay, and let's preview that one. So we're going from flapping to flying. What happens? And I'll do it myself. So flapping, and then flying kicks in, and it's just wings outstretched. Great. And then it goes back to the beginning, and that's where it looks a bit janky, but that's fine. The last one we want to do is what happens when the player would press the space bar. All of this is so the on flap, that flap trigger that causes the transition from flying to flapping is on this when the user presses the space bar. So what happens when the user presses the space bar while the flapping animation is already playing? Well, then we really want to restart that flapping animation. So I'm going to add one more transition in to represent that. And this one I'm going to configure as well. And this time I don't want an exit time. This one is coming from the spacebar press, so the flap condition again. and I will want to have 0. Basically I want a 0. I put these scrubbers right next to each other because I want, whenever that happens, I want the flapping animation to kick in immediately with no transition. Yeah, it's not an ideal way to do it, but it's just nice and simple and saves us some bugs further down the track. So if I press play and have a look through it myself, so I go flapping and then I press space, starts flapping again. Okay, that's fair enough. And yeah, I think that's all I want in the Animator controller at the moment. So it's time now to go to the code and to start triggering those animations from the code. Yeah, so let's do that. So in the code now, we have our, oh yeah, and yeah, we still have the Animator controller from the last lesson, so that's all good. So I should probably put the, I want to access this Animator controller. Animator controller. Animator. It's just an animator, isn't it? Okay, Animator. Like this. Animator controller is the name for it inside the Unity user interface. And so I want to get that out as soon as the script starts as well. So get component and then animator. Cool. And that's ready to use. So we can now start triggering some of these animations. So let's try that. So basically when the spacebar is pressed is when we want to start seeing the bird flapping its wings. So we're going to need to deal with some input. And we can do that just here. So I'm pressing the spacebar, make the bird move up. So if input.get key down, and I'm going to look for the spacebar. Okay, then we can trigger our animation. So yeah, let's just do the animation part first. So animator.setTrigger. Remember we're triggering that flap thing I created in the Animator controller earlier, the flap trigger, and like this. Okay, cool. So that should animate it. While I'm here, I'm going to add in the code to make the bird move up the screen as well, just to make this a bit interesting. So yeah, so I need the velocity to be changed in the upward direction. So to do that, I'm going to say velocity dot y equals, and I need to increase it. So I'm going to create this thing called a velocity boost, and I'm going to use that variable for this. So let's just do this right now. Const float velocity boost. And this one I'm going to put set to 8f. And you should experiment with different values for that and see what happens yourselves. So, yep, so that's good to go. And we can come back now and try that out. The bird should fly and flap its wings at the same time. And let's see what happens. Come back here, wait for the Unity to load its new assemblies. Here we go. So I press play, and hopefully we see some action when I press the spacebar. Yeah, nice. So it's flying up the screen and still dropping down with gravity, as we expect. Cool. Okay, so that's sort of the next piece. You might notice that I'm implementing kind of incrementally or piece by piece this functionality. That's a good way to go with game dev, rather than trying to do hundreds of things at once or many things at once. Just break your problem down into small pieces. So next piece then is to the next piece is to add some tilt to the bird to make it look upwards whenever it's flapping its wings. Okay, so in order to do this, I actually need to edit one of the animations, the flapping one. Oh, don't double click on it like that. So I click on the flapping animation in the bird FBX we have. I'm going to click edit. Come down here to events, and I'm going to add these two things here. Two events, but one for the start of the animation where, so when the bird starts flapping its wings in the code, I'm going to receive that event and then tilt the bird's be looking upwards. And then I'm going to add a second one at the end of the animation where another event where the code will receive that event at the end and then put the bird back looking just straight forward. So I need to add those events like this. Just click. And the first one just appears at 0, which is handy, and I'm going to call this one on flapping start. So that's the first one. And then I'm going to create a second one. I wonder if, yeah, try that. So the second one's over here. I'm going to drag that to the end, right to the end of the animation, and I'm going to call this one on flapping finish. Okay. Now the last thing I need to do is press apply here, and that will actually update the animation inside the FBX file. If I don't do that, then it won't be saved. Okie dokie. And yes, that's good to me. All right, so what is the bird going to be looking at? Like, which we need to give it something to look at when it tilts. This is just one way to solve this in Unity. So what I'll do is I'll actually introduce like an empty object in the game, create empty, and I'll call it look at point. And I'll just move this like kind of off the screen and quite far out in the distance. I'll zoom out a bit actually. So that whenever I press space and the animation starts playing, the code receives the event, tells the bird to look at that point. Okay, so I'll just chuck that up there, and that should be good. And now last thing I need to do is on the bird then, so in the code I'll need to introduce that variable as well. So back in the code, I need a public variable now to slot in that look at point. So public game object, this is look at point. Okay, so when I come back to Unity now and click on my bird, there's an empty lookout point here, and I'm going to grab the lookout point from the hierarchy and put it in that place. So now we can change the code so that it actually does, so the bird does look at that point. All right, cool. Next thing. So yeah, we have the bird flapping on when the space bar is pressed, and we have to introduce now two functions that are going to be triggered when those events that we just added occur when the big animation starts and begins. So the first one is called, I'll just grab it from here actually, the first one from here is called the on flapping start. Okay, so this is, I don't know if it needs to be public to be honest, but okay, on flapping start function, and I'll just chuck in the other one now while I'm at it, void on flapping finish. Okay, so in the on flapping start is where we want to actually tilt the bird. Oh yeah, so I'll move this as well, so that flaps the bird's wings. This is where we want to tilt the bird upwards. And then to do that, it's kind of straightforward. There's a nice simple way to do that, transform.lookAt, and then we just need to give it the look at point that we just put into this script, and give it its transform. Okay. But when the flapping finishes, we also want to untilt bird after flapping finishes, right? So this one we're going to access the bird's transform again. So this is the bird's rotation, scale, and location, and we're going to set its Euler angles. What are Euler angles? They're just the angles on the x, y, and z axis in degrees. So a circle has 360 degrees. That's what Euler angles are. So we're going to set that to a new vector to represent those angles on x, y, and z. And we're just going to tell it 0, 0, 0. So each of those angles is 0, just to be really clear. And that should be enough to see the bird tilting upwards when we play the game. So let's have a look here. I press play, and hopefully when I press space, he tilts his head upwards, and then eventually at the end of the animation, drops down. There we go. So that's nice and simple, and if I press space a few times, it still kind of works. It does work correctly. And there we go. Cool. So that was how to set up the movement and animation of your Flappy Bird for using the Animator controller and a little bit of coding. There are, of course, many ways you could do that. Like, for example, you could add the animation through this tilting animation. You could add that in the Blender model itself. And that would require blending two animations together. So that's another thing you could try. And if you wanted to also actually code the animation, so rather than create the animation, rather than trigger this this flicking of the bird to look at something, you could also actually animate that procedurally, so animate it in code too, using a coroutine, and that's another complex kind of way to do it, but you could look into that too. Okay, so yeah, thanks everyone. Next time we'll be looking at the pipes, building some pipes and having them move towards the bird to simulate the bird flying into pipes.